Have you ever wondered who stood at the heart of every village, quietly working to turn the hard grain from the fields into the flour that became daily bread? How did one man with his stones and wheels hold such importance in the 16th century? The answer lies in the life of the miller, whose work was dusty, demanding, and often uncelebrated, yet utterly essential. Before we drift into tonight's story, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss a gentle journey through history. What did the miller's day begin with? He rose early, for the wheel never turned itself. If his mill stood by a stream, he checked the water flow. If it was a windmill, he gauged the strength and direction of the wind. Why did this matter? Because the mill relied entirely on nature's power. Too much water and the wheel might be damaged, too little, and the stones would barely move. Too strong a gust of wind could tear sails, while too weak a breeze left the mill silent. Did this make the miller nervous? At times, yes, for his livelihood depended on forces he could not control. Yet he also became a careful observer of the world around him, reading the signs of water and air as others read the signs of the seasons. What happened once the mill was ready? Grain arrived in heavy sacks, carried on backs or carts from nearby farms. Families brought their harvest, measured carefully, for every kernel was precious. How was the grain turned into flour? The miller poured it slowly into a hopper that fed the stones. One stone remained still, the other rotated, and between them the grain was crushed into fine meal. Could it be done quickly? Yes, but only with precision. If the stones pressed too hard, the flour burned from friction. If too loose, the kernels slipped through unbroken. The miller's hand on the lever made the difference between waste and nourishment. What was the mill like inside? Imagine the constant rumble of stone against stone, the creak of wood, the whir of gears. Dust filled the air until every surface, beams, sacks, clothing, skin, wore a pale coat of flour. Was it unpleasant? Perhaps, but to the miller it was simply the mark of his trade. His hair whitened long before his years, not from age, but from the powder that clung to him daily. Did he complain? Some did, but many accepted it as part of their craft, as familiar to them as the scent of earth was to the farmer. How did the miller earn his living? By taking a portion of the grain he ground. Each family knew that some measure would remain with him as payment. Did this create suspicion? Often, villagers watched his scales closely, fearing he might keep too much. Was the fear always fair? Not always, for many millers were honest. But the position bred mistrust, because the miller held power over the food that sustained life. Even so, could the village survive without him? No. Bread was the staff of life, and without flour there could be none. What happened to the flour? Once ground, it left the mill in sacks, carried back to cottages or to the baker's oven. There it became loaves whose smell filled the streets, whose warmth fed families. Did the miller feel pride? Quietly, yes. He might not shape the dough or bake the bread, but he knew that every crust, every crumb, owed its existence to the grind of his stones. His work was hidden, but his influence was felt on every table. Was the labor easy? Never. Stones had to be sharpened, gears mended, ropes replaced. Floods could damage a water mill, storms could tear the sails of a windmill. Did the miller rest? Rarely, for a silent mill meant hungry mouths. He lived with the hum of machinery always in his ears. His hands calloused from lifting sacks and adjusting levers, his clothes permanently marked by flour dust. Yet he also carried respect, for in his steady work lay the rhythm of survival. So what did it mean to be a miller in the 16th century? It meant to live between the field and the hearth, to stand at the bridge between harvest and bread. It meant to master stone and wheel, to balance fairness with suspicion, to labor endlessly yet hold quiet pride in knowing the village's life depended on his skill. The miller's life was not glamorous, but it was vital, for without him the grain of the earth could never become the bread that kept hunger at bay. Have you ever wondered why the miller, dusty and weary from his endless work, stood at the very center of village life? What made his wheel and stone so important that the entire community seemed to turn in rhythm with his? The answer is that, in the 16th century, bread was not just food, it was survival. And without the miller, the chain between field and table would break. When did villagers most often visit the mill? After the harvest, of course, but also throughout the year. Families carried sacks of grain in carts, on donkeys, or across their shoulders, knowing that their own kitchens could not grind it finely. Enough for good bread. Did everyone come in turn? They did, though some came eagerly and others reluctantly. For while they needed the miller's stones, they also eyed his scales with caution. Why the caution? Because grain was precious. A family's winter's strength rested in those kernels, and handing them over meant trusting the miller to be fair in his share. What did the miller take as payment? A portion of flour measured carefully. Did villagers begrudge this? Often, for they imagined the miller growing fat on their labor. Was this entirely fair? Not always. The work of maintaining the mill, sharpening the stones, and keeping the gears in motion was heavy and constant. Still, suspicion clung to the trade, and the miller learned to live with both dependence and distrust. How did the village sound when the mill turned? The creak of wood, the rumble of stone, and the splash of water or groan of sails filled the air. Was this noise a nuisance? No, it was reassurance. A silent mill meant hunger, while a working mill meant bread soon to be baked. Did villagers listen for it? Yes, as surely as they listened for the smith's hammer or the clink of coins at the market. The mill's steady voice was part of the daily music of the community. Did the miller stand apart from the village? In some ways, yes. His work kept him inside his dusty walls, apart from the chatter of the square or the gossip of neighbors. But did that mean he was isolated? Not entirely. Villagers saw him often when they brought grain or collected flour, and though they sometimes muttered about his fairness, they also greeted him as a man whose trade could not be spared. Was his position enviable? Perhaps not, but it was secure, for every family depended on his wheel. How did the baker and the miller connect? Closely. The baker needed steady flour to fire his ovens, and the miller supplied it. Did they always agree? Not always. The baker wanted fine flour, while the miller balanced his grinding to protect his stones. Yet both knew they were partners in sustaining the village. Bread on the table meant miller and baker had done their work in harmony, even if their dealings were sometimes sharp. What about the children of the village? Did they notice the mill? They did, peeking in curiously, watching the dust rise and the stones turn. Did the mill seem magical to them? Perhaps, though, to the miller it was simply labor. Yet even children knew that the flour carried from those doors would soon become loaves to fill their bellies. The mill was part of their lives, as surely as the fields or the market. So how did the miller tie himself into the rhythm of the whole village? He did it through necessity. Every loaf, every crust, every humble meal of bread and broth began with the dust on his hands and the turning of his stones. Was he loved? Not always. Was he respected? Always, for without his wheel, the rhythm of the village would falter and hunger would creep in where once there had been strength. Have you ever thought about the sheer weight of work carried by a miller's body? How did one man manage the constant lifting, pulling, and tending of stones, wheels, and sacks, day after day, season after season? The answer is that the life of a miller was as physical as it was technical, demanding muscles hardened by effort and a frame accustomed to strain. What was the heaviest part of his work? Without doubt, the grain itself. Each sack brought by, the villagers weighed as much as a man's strength could bear. Did the miller have help? Sometimes an apprentice or a hired boy shared the load, but often the miller himself hoisted the sacks upon his back, staggering beneath the burden as he carried them up ramps or across wooden floors. Could he refuse? No, for if the grain did not reach the hopper, the stones could not grind. Every sack moved by his arms was the promise of loaves to come. And what of the stones themselves? Millstones were vast and heavy, each weighing more than several men combined. Did the miller move them? Not alone, but he bore responsibility for their care. From time to time they had to be lifted, shifted, and sharpened with iron tools. Was this easy? Never. It was dangerous and exhausting, requiring teamwork, patience, and endless caution. A slipped rope or careless hand could crush a limb in an instant. What toll did this labor take on the body? Shoulders bowed under years of carrying, backs bent from strain, hands calloused and cracked. Did the miller complain? He might groan. In private, but in public he carried on. His trade was his identity, and to falter was to admit weakness. Was he ever idle? Seldom. If not carrying grain, he was tending ropes, cleaning gears, or sharpening stones. His body knew no rest beyond sleep, and even then aches followed him into the hammock. Did the dust affect him? Yes, more than most realized. Flour dust filled the air, clinging to lungs as well as clothes. Did he cough often? Many did. The fine powder choked the breath, reddened the eyes, and coated every surface. Was it dangerous? Perhaps not immediately, but over years it weakened the chest, leaving many millers short of breath long before old age. Still, they endured, for the village's bread depended on them. How did the miller's appearance betray his trade? His hair and beard carried a constant whiteness from flour. His skin grew rough from wind and water, and his clothes, no matter how often brushed, bore stains of dust. Could anyone mistake him in the market square? Never. The mark of the mill clung to him as surely as a blacksmith's soot or a fisherman's salt. Did this make him proud? Perhaps quietly, for while villagers muttered suspicions, they also recognized the strength and endurance his trade required. So what did the labor of the miller truly mean? It meant a life of muscle and dust, of constant lifting and endless tending. It meant scars on hands, strain in the back, and breath shortened by flour in the air. But it also meant purpose. For every ache and every bruise was exchanged for the sight of flour-filling sacks, bread rising in ovens, and families eating meals that gave them strength. The miller's body bore the weight of his trade, and in that weight lay the proof of his importance to the village. If you're enjoying this quiet stroll through history, don't forget to subscribe for more peaceful stories like this. Have you ever imagined stepping into a 16th century mill, not just to see its wheels and stones, but to sense the entire atmosphere that wrapped around the miller each day? What did it sound like, smell like, and feel like to live within that space where grain became flour? The answer is that the mill was not merely a workplace. It was an entire world of sensations, both harsh and comforting, that shaped the life of its master. What was the first sound that struck the ear? Always the grind of stone upon stone. Was it loud? Yes, a steady, deep rumble that never ceased while grain poured. To the untrained ear, it might seem dull or overwhelming, but to the miller it was music, the proof that his labor was alive. Did he notice when the sound changed? Instantly. A slight shift in pitch told him the stones were too close, or that the grain was running low. For him, sound was as much a guide as sight. And what about the other noises? There was the creak of the great wheel, whether turned by flowing water or catching wind. Wooden gears groaned, ropes strained, and sacks thudded onto planks as they were dragged across the floor. Was it chaotic? Not to the miller. To him, it was the language of his craft. Each noise told him something, that the wheel was steady, that the grain was flowing, that his mill lived and worked as it should. What scents filled the air? The sharp tang of fresh ground grain, warm and nutty, mixed with the musty odor, old sacks and the faint dampness carried from the stream or the sails outside. Was it pleasant? In part. To some it smelled heavy and cloying, but to the miller it was the fragrance of usefulness, of food in the making. Did he grow tired of it? Perhaps, but like the farmer smelling earth or the fisher smelling salt, he came to accept it as part of his being. What did the mill look like to those who entered? Sunlight often streamed through small cracks or windows, catching clouds of flour dust that floated in the air like mist. Did it seem magical? To a child peeking in, perhaps yes. To the miller, it was simply the sign of work, though he brushed it constantly from his brow and beard. The beams overhead darkened with years of smoke from lanterns, and with the settling of dust, while the floor grew pale with endless powder. Was the mill clean? Not in the sense of spotless order, but in the sense of constant care, swept daily to keep the machinery clear and the grain pure. What did it feel like to work inside? The air was warm from friction, sometimes choking with dust, sometimes damp when weather pressed outside. Did the miller mind? He endured it, for it was his world. The rough wood of beams, the coarse weave. Of sacks, the cool stone beneath his hand as he tested the millstones. All these textures marked his day as surely as the hours marked his watch. So what was the mill in truth? It was more than a machine. It was a living space filled with noise, scent, dust, and weight. It was a place where every sense was engaged, where the miller became attuned to the smallest change, hearing shifts. In tone, smelling damp grain, feeling wear in the stones. The mill was his world, and the world of the village as well, for in that dusty chamber lay the secret of every loaf baked and every family fed. Have you ever wondered how the villagers truly saw the miller? The man who turned their grain into flour yet often stood apart from their lives? Was he admired, envied, or mistrusted? The answer is that his reputation was a mixture of all these things, for the miller's work gave life to the community, but his control over food made him both necessary and suspect. Why did villagers depend on him so heavily? Because bread was the foundation of every meal. Without flour, there could be no loaves to fill stomachs during the long winters. Could families grind their own grain? In small amounts, yes, with hand mills or mortar, but it was slow and exhausting. To feed a household week after week, they needed the power of the mill's stones. This made the miller essential, the one man who linked the harvest to the hearth. But why was he mistrusted? Because he took a portion of every sack he ground. Was this unfair? Not in itself it was. His payment, the way he supported his own household. Yet grain was precious, and every kernel mattered to families who counted their stores carefully. Did they suspect him of taking more than his share? Often, and even if he was honest, suspicion lingered, for no villager could see inside the mill. During the grinding, flour went in, flour came out, and only the miller knew exactly what passed through the stones. Did this suspicion isolate him? In some ways, yes. The miller was greeted with politeness, but sometimes with narrowed eyes. Did children whisper tales about him? They did, inventing stories about his dust-covered clothes and his solitary hours. Was he thought of as greedy? Sometimes, though many millers lived no richer than their neighbors, yet his work placed him in a strange position, both needed and doubted, respected, yet watched. How did the miller himself respond to this reputation? By carrying on. He could not abandon his portion, for his own survival depended on it. Could he argue with villagers? Rarely, for disputes could damage his standing. Instead, he let the steady grind of his stones answer for him, proving through action that he fulfilled his duty. Did some families trust him fully? Yes, those who saw fairness in his measure, who noted that year after year their flour seemed enough. Was there also respect for his skill? Certainly, for though villagers might mutter, they knew his craft was not easily learned. Adjusting the stones, tending the wheel, repairing the gears, these were tasks beyond ordinary hands. Did people admire the way he kept the mill running? They did, though often quietly. Without him, the village would struggle, and everyone knew it. So what was the miller's reputation? A balance of suspicion and respect. Was he loved? Not always. Was he necessary? Always. He walked through the village carrying the dust of his trade, sometimes greeted warmly, sometimes watched with caution, but never ignored. His presence reminded everyone that food, survival, and trust were bound together, and that one man's skill could make the difference between hunger and strength. Have you ever wondered how the turning of the seasons shaped the miller's life? Did his work remain the same each month, or did the flow of time and weather dictate the rhythm of his labor? The answer is that the miller's year was as tied to the seasons as the farmer's, though in a different way, for his stones turned hardest when fields were full and slowed when the land fell quiet. When was the busiest time? Without doubt, after the harvest. As soon as the grain was cut, threshed, and stored, families brought it in steady streams to the mill. Did the miller rest then? Hardly. Day after day he bent beneath heavy sacks, adjusted his stones, and worked until the last light faded. Could the mill stop? No, for the village depended on flour to carry them through the coming winter. The creak of the wheel and the rumble of stones often lasted from dawn into dusk, echoing across fields where the harvest had only just ended. And what of winter? Did the mill fall silent? Not entirely. Families still brought grain to be ground, though less often, for their stores had to last the long, cold months. Was it easier work? Somewhat, for the flow of customers slowed, giving the miller time to repair his gears, sharpen his stones, and mend whatever damage the year had done. Did storms threaten him? Yes, for watermills froze in hard frosts, and windmills sometimes stood still when snow pressed heavy on their sails. Winter was quieter, but it was never idle. How did spring change things? It brought renewed energy. Farmers sowed their fields, but grain still needed grinding from the previous year's stores. Did the miller prepare differently? He did, watching the water levels rise with melting snow or adjusting his windmill to catch the blustery breezes of spring. Spring was a season of balance, not as frantic as harvest, but steady enough to keep the mill alive with sound and dust. And summer? Did it bring peace? In part. The heaviest work was done, and families held back grain for the new harvest. Yet summer was also a time of watchfulness, for storms could flood the streams that turned the wheels, or sudden calms could leave sails hanging limp. Did the miller worry? Always, for his trade depended not only on human labor, but also on the moods of nature. So what did the cycle of seasons mean for him? It meant that his life was never static. One month brought exhaustion, another brought quiet repair. One season demanded endless labor, another required patience and maintenance. Was his year easier than the farmer's? Not exactly. The farmer bent over soil and crops, while the miller bent over stones and sacks. Each was bound to the seasons, in his own way, and each knew that survival rested on the success of the other. So what was the miller's year in truth? A constant dance with time itself, rushing when the harvest came, steady in the in-between, quieter but tense in winter's chill. His trade was not timeless or unchanging, but woven tightly into the fabric of the seasons, just as surely as the village itself was. And in this turning rhythm, the miller found both hardship and meaning. For his stones never turned in isolation, but always in step with the world beyond his dusty walls. Have you ever wondered how a miller's knowledge was carried from one generation to the next? Did boys simply step into the trade, or was the craft slowly handed down, piece by piece, under the patient eye of a master? The answer is that the life of a miller was too complex to be learned in a day. Apprenticeship was the path, and through it the skills of stone, wheel, and grain passed steadily forward. Who became an apprentice? Often a young boy from the village, sometimes a son of the miller himself, sometimes a neighbor's child whose family sought him a trade. Was it an easy choice? Not always, for the work was heavy, the hours long, and the air thick with dust. But to have a skill meant security, and the miller's trade promised both livelihood and importance. What did the apprentice do at first? The simplest, hardest tasks, lifting sacks, sweeping dust, and carrying flour. Did he touch the stones at once? Never. Those great wheels required knowledge and caution. Only after months, even years, of small duties was the apprentice trusted with adjusting the gap or feeding the grain. Why so cautious? Because a mistake could ruin both flour and stones. wasting food that no family could spare. How did he learn? By watching. The apprentice stood close, noting how the miller listened to the sound of grinding, how he sniffed the flour for freshness, how he tested the stones with careful hands. Did the miller explain? Sometimes, but often he expected the boy to notice on his own, to grow attentive to the signs that guided the craft. Was this harsh? It might seem so, but it ensured that the apprentice became as sensitive as the master, able to sense problems before they grew. Did apprentices complain? Often, especially at the endless lifting and the heavy dust. But did they leave? Rarely, for trades were precious. To endure the mill's demands was to earn a respected place. And over time, did the boy grow stronger? Yes, his back broadened, his hands toughened, and his patience deepened. The mill shaped him as surely as it shaped the grain. What reward waited when the training ended? The chance to become a miller himself, perhaps to inherit the old mill, or to build a new one in another village. Did all apprentices reach that point? Not all. Some left, some failed, some turned to other trades. But those who succeeded carried the craft forward, ensuring that flour continued to flow, that bread continued to rise, that life itself remained steady in the village. So what did apprenticeship mean? It meant long hours of labor, sharp eyes, learning from every motion of the master, and patience tested daily by dust and noise. But it also meant inheritance, not of land or coin, but of knowledge that could not be written in books, only lived. The apprentice became the future, and in him the miller's stones found a new keeper. Have you ever wondered what hidden risks lurked in the quiet turning of a mill's wheel? At first glance, the trade might seem simple. Grain poured in, flour poured out, stones grinding steadily between. Yet beneath that steady rhythm lay dangers that could wound, maim, or even end a life. How did millers and their helpers endure such risks every day? The answer is that caution, habit, and sheer resilience carried them through. What was the greatest danger? The machinery itself. Heavy. Wooden gears spun with relentless force, ropes stretched taut, and stones weighing more than oxen pressed against one another. Could a hand caught in the wrong place escape unharmed? Rarely. Was the mill forgiving? Never. A careless step, a loose sleeve, a moment's distraction could end in injury. Did apprentices learn this quickly? Yes, often through the stern warnings of their masters who knew that the mill showed no mercy to inexperience. Were falls a danger too? Certainly. Grain sacks had to be carried up steep ladders and narrow platforms. Did men slip? They did, especially when flour dust made the wood slick beneath their boots. A stumble could mean bruises or broken bones, and sometimes worse. Did this make the work lighter for the young? No. It taught them to move carefully, to plant each, step firmly, to grip ropes and rails with steady hands. And what of the stones themselves? They had to be lifted and sharpened, a task requiring strength and skill. Was this without risk? Not at all. A stone could slip from its rigging, crushing anything below. Did the miller fear this? Always, for he knew that even a moment's lapse could turn routine into disaster. Yet the stones had to be tended, and so he faced the danger again and again. Could fire threaten a mill? Yes, though not from hearth flames. Flour dust hung thick in the air, fine enough that a spark might set it alight in a sudden burst. Did millers know this? They did, and lanterns were used with caution, every flame shielded, every light handled with care. Still, accidents sometimes happened, and tales of mills lost to fire traveled from village to village, warnings in themselves. How did millers cope with such constant risk? By living cautiously, by training their apprentices carefully, and by accepting danger as part of the trade. Did they fear it? Of course. But did they allow fear to halt their work? Never, for the village could not wait, and bread could not be delayed. Every sack ground was proof that duty outweighed risk. So what did the dangers of the mill teach? That even the most ordinary trade carried hidden perils. The steady sound of grinding stones was comforting to villagers, but to the miller it was also a reminder of the strength and risk bound into every turn. To live as a miller was to walk daily with danger, not with swords or battlefields, but with wood, rope, stone, and dust. And yet, through caution and persistence, he endured, making the trade as safe as any could be, and ensuring that the lifeblood of the village, its bread, never ceased to flow. Have you ever wondered how the work of a single dusty miller connected not only to his own village but to the larger world beyond? Was his grinding of grain only for neighbors, or did the stones of his mill echo into markets, towns, and even distant cities? The answer is that while the mill stood firmly in its village, its product, flour, carried outward, tying small communities to the broader currents of trade. Who came first to the mill? Always the villagers, carrying grain from their own harvest. But did merchants come as well? Yes, sometimes traders brought sacks from nearby farms or estates, seeking flour to sell in town markets. Did the miller welcome this? Often, for larger orders, meant steady work, though he had to balance them carefully against the needs of his neighbors. Could he risk angering villagers by favoring merchants? Never, for his first duty was to those who depended on him daily. What happened to flour that left the mill in merchant carts? It traveled along roads to towns where bakers fired great ovens, supplying bread for markets crowded with buyers. Did the miller ever see these markets himself? Sometimes, if he delivered flour or went to town for tools and supplies, but often he remained at his post, knowing that his stones worked just as surely for city tables as for village hearths. Did landlords or noble estates use the mill? Frequently. Large estates brought heavy loads, filling the mill with more grain than most families saw in a year. Did this make the miller's work easier? No, it was harder, for such loads strained the machinery and demanded long hours. But did it raise his standing? To some degree, yes. To serve both farmer and noble showed the breadth of his reach. How did the mill connect to the rhythm of the market year? Closely. Harvest time filled it with work, but fairs and markets spread its product farther still. A sack of flour ground in a quiet village might find its way to a distant household, carried on the back of a mule, piled into a cart, or loaded onto a river barge. Did the miller think of this as he poured grain into the hopper? Perhaps only rarely. Yet unknowingly, his labor was part of a chain that stretched far beyond his dusty door. And what of money? Did the miller earn coin as well as grain? Yes, especially from merchants and estates. Did this wealth make him envied sometimes? Yet most of it was spent on maintaining the mill, repairing wheels, buying stone, and paying helpers. Still, the sight of coin in his pouch gave him a connection. to trade that few ordinary villagers possessed. So what did the mill represent in the wider world? It was both local and far-reaching. To the villagers, it was the place where their grain became bread. To merchants, it was a step in the chain of commerce. To landlords, it was a tool for managing estates. The miller might live among dust and stones, but his work rippled outward into markets and towns, reminding us that even the humblest trade could connect to the larger flow of history. Let's pause for just a moment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to join us for more calm stories. Have you ever thought about why the miller's life, dusty and weary as it was, still lingers in our imagination centuries later? Was he only a man turning grain into flour, or was he something more, a figure who quietly shaped the survival of every household around him? The answer is that the miller stood at a crossroads between land and life, between harvest and hearth, embodying the steady endurance that kept entire villages alive. What made his trade endure? It was necessity. Fields could grow wheat and rye, but without the miller, the grain remained locked within its husk. Only his stones could release its strength, and only his skill could do so without waste. Was this skill small? Not at all. Each adjustment of the stones, each turn of the wheel, carried the difference between abundance and hunger. His craft was not a luxury, but the very foundation of the community's survival. Did his work bring him glory? Rarely. Few praised the miller when they broke their bread, though all owed him for it. Did he mind? Perhaps at times, when suspicion weighed heavy, when villagers muttered that his scales were unfair. Yet he carried on, for he knew that behind every crust of bread lay his labor, even if unspoken. Was the miller rich? Not often. His portion of grain or his coins, earned from merchants, paid for repairs, tools, and helpers. But was he important? Always. No feast, no market, no simple family supper could exist without flour, and flour could not exist without the mill. His presence, even when mistrusted, was never dismissed. And what remains of him now? Though his wheel may have long since rotted, though his stones may have fallen silent, the memory of his trade lingers in history. We still see old windmills and watermills standing across the countryside, reminders of a time when one man's dusty work linked field and table. Do they not remind us of his endurance? They do, for in their beams and stones lies the echo of countless hands lifting sacks, countless feet climbing ladders, countless backs bending under grain. So what does the miller's story teach us? That true importance often hides in quiet labor, that survival is shaped not only by kings and merchants, but by those who grind the grain, knead the dough, and keep the wheels turning, the millers. Life was not filled with spectacle, but it was filled with meaning, a meaning that lived in every loaf of bread shared by his village. And if we close our eyes now and imagine that steady grind of stone upon stone, can we not almost hear the heartbeat of a world long gone? A heartbeat made not of glory, but of patience, duty, and endurance. That was the miller's gift, one that sustained life then and still reminds us now that history is built as much by quiet hands as by loud voices.